Hello and welcome back to another MySQL tutorial. So here we'll be looking at table constraints, the not null, primary key default, foreign key and check. So not null means that the column cannot have the null value in it. Instead, if nothing is specified when inserting a row for that column, it will use whatever default is specified. Of course, we can specify a default, or if no default is specified, whatever MySQL's default is for that data type, that will be used. So take this example here. We have a table person, and let's look at the structure. We can see that we have a structure here of ID, name, and age. We have a primary key. So typically all primary keys are not null. So that's what's been applied here. So no refers to not null. And you can see that name and age has also been applied not null. So that we can change this by going into the field, and across here we have this option here. So by selecting it, it refers to null, and if we want not null, we deselect. So let's just try and apply something within this table. Let's insert something. So we'll insert a primary key, and then we'll leave these blank. So we do receive a warning, but the row is still inserted. So let's see what the default values are that have been applied. So you can see here that for the varchar, there is no default value. And then for the age, it's a 0. So that moves us on to the next constraint, the default. So here we can now add on not null and also then define the default. So it's just the keyword default, and then we apply whatever the default should be. So let's make this new table, person, and here we've defined the default private. So we create this, and now let's go into the table and then insert some data. So here we're just going to insert the number 12, and here you notice that private has already been entered into the field. So if I press go and then look at the actual data, you can see we have the default value inserted. So you can see from this example, or the next example, we're using check. So check basically is a constraint that allows us to restrict the values that can be placed within the column. So here, for example, we create the person table again, and we have ID with the not null and primary key. And then we have age. We define it as an integer, and it must be not null. But this time we also use the constraint check. So this system only allows potentially users that are 18 or over, and then the person has to be between 18 and 80. So age is more than or equal to 18, and age is less than or equal to 80. So again, in our database, we're just running the SQL. And now we're going to select the table and try and add some data to the database. So if we insert, for example, an ID of, say, 12, and then the age is 90. So we shouldn't be allowed to enter this in the system. So we press go, and you can see that we have an error. So this error, it will prevent us from entering data into the database, a new row. So when I click on browse, you can see that nothing has been entered into our database. So let's just try and insert again and add some values that should be correct. So 18. There we go. So now we have an entry or new entry in the database. So next up is the primary key. We've already seen a few examples of utilizing the primary key, and you can see it's just the keyword primary key. So typically, like I've suggested, the primary key is a constraint which identifies the column or set of columns that have values that uniquely identify a row in a table. So just take this example again, this person table. This has an ID of 12. So this is going to be a primary key. So let's just make sure that that's the primary key. Yep, so the key has been defined. We can define a primary key by selecting primary key after selecting one of the columns. And so this is a constraint that prevents us from having unique values, in this case, within this column here. So if I try to insert some more data, and have an ID of 12, you can see that we're going to have an error and no data is inserted into the database. So let's finish up by using a foreign key. So a foreign key is a column or combination of columns that is used to establish and enforce a relationship between the data in two tables. So here we're going to create a new row called user ID, and then we're going to apply a foreign key to it. So what we need to do is define, first of all, what row we want to apply as a foreign key, and then where we want it to reference. So a reference applies or refers to a different table that we have in our database. In this case, the table user. And then we define where we want to make this link to within this table. So which column? So the column we want to use is user ID. So you can see here I have a table called user and it has a user ID field. So let's make a new table using SQL. So create table person, we're going to have an ID and a user ID, and then we're going to apply a foreign key. And we're going to first select, like I said, the actual row or field, so our user ID, and then the table. We reference the table user, and then inside the user there should be user ID, which we just saw. And here we're going to make a link. So if we run this code, we can now see that was successful. So going back into person and looking at the structure, you can now see I have this gold coin and a silver coin, denoting the fact that this is a foreign key and the gold coin is a primary key. Okay, so that goes through some of the basic constraints that we can apply within a table. So hopefully you've learned something there, and now we'll move on to the next tutorial.